Queer biblical interpretation is something I absolutely love to read because the scholars who use this method are so frequently able to point out things in the text that are just beneath the nose of so many Bible readers who can't see it because of the heteronormative assumptions they're bringing to their interpretations. And this debate about how best to translate and interpret Genesis 3:16, where God imposes consequences on Eve for her disobedience in the Garden of Eden, is a debate fueled in large part by these heteronormative assumptions. Let me explain. The vast majority of Bible translations, including the ones I appreciate most, like the NRSV UE and the JPS, and Robert Alter's translation, will all translate the end of Genesis chapter 3, verse 16 as, "Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." But a small minority of Bible translations, including the ESV and the NLT, and then some popular apologetics websites like Got Questions, and plenty of preachers all over the place, will either translate or interpret the end of this verse as, "Her desire will be contrary to or against her husband, and he will rule over her." Now, grammatically speaking, the case here is pretty clear. The Hebrew preposition el, not to be confused with the God's name el, is translated as to, toward, or in this case for, 99 times out of 100. It's almost always used in the context of motion, somebody moving to or towards something else. But there are a handful of legitimate instances in which the Hebrew preposition el can be translated as against. What all these instances have in common is that there's something adversarial or violent implied by the subjects performing the action in the verse. For example, if somebody rises up in rebellion, el someone else, then in that instance it would be appropriate to translate el as against. Or if you see an army gathering on the horizon, el, a city, you would also translate that as against rather than to or toward. But since in Genesis 3:16 we're talking about desire, and since this word only ever appears in an interpersonal context again in the Song of Songs to talk about erotic desire, there's absolutely nothing adversarial implied in this particular verse, and so it should be translated as to, towards, or more naturally sounding in English, for. Her desire will be for her husband, and he will rule over her. So if there isn't a strong grammatical case to be made for translating this as against or contrary to or something like that, why do translations do it? Why do apologetics websites talk about it? And this is where those heteronormative assumptions come in. Simply put, straight Bible readers, and straight male Bible readers in particular, don't like the idea that Eve's desire for her husband is a punishment. They would much prefer a situation in which Eve's disagreement with her husband, in which Eve having desires contrary to her husband, was the punishment instead. And when people have this conscious or unconscious need to interpret the Bible in heteronormative ways, they're going to be willing to ignore the grammar of a verse in order to secure a more comfortable interpretation for themselves. And I also suspect that translating this as "her desire will be contrary to her husband" is actually trying to deflect an even more radical possibility just beneath the surface. See, all the consequences imposed on the serpent and Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 are reversals of the previous situation. You can see this most clearly with the serpent, whose consequence is to crawl on its belly and to eat the dust, that is to say, to flick out its tongue as snakes do. Now, this doesn't seem like much of a consequence at all because this seems like normal serpent behavior. So we have to imagine that prior to this moment, prior to these consequences being imposed on the serpent, it didn't crawl on its belly, and it didn't flick out its tongue to smell the air. It must have done something else. Similarly, with Adam's consequence, he's forced to work by the sweat of his brow through thorns and thistles. Agriculture is going to be difficult. It's going to be hard to make food. This, of course, is the default state of affairs for the vast majority of people in the ancient world. So how is this a consequence? Well, again, we have to imagine that prior to this moment, that wasn't the case. Prior to this moment in the paradise of Eden, getting food was easy to do. So if Eve's consequence is that her desire will be contrary to her husband, then we have to imagine that prior to this moment in the paradise of the Garden of Eden, her desires were not contrary to her husband. She agreed with her husband all the time. And that's a view of paradise that's very comfortable for straight male interpreters. But if Eve's consequence is that her desire will be for her husband, then this too must be a reversal of the prior state of affairs. Prior to this moment, her desire must not have been for her husband. It must have been for something or someone else. And there aren't too many options here. It could have been for herself, it could have been for God, or perhaps it could have been for some woman that does not yet exist. Wherever her desire was orientated before, it was not, strictly speaking, straight. This interpretive possibility obviously makes some people uncomfortable, so the more they can translate it away, the better. These queer interpretive possibilities are always present in the text. It just takes a special set of eyes less affected by heteronormative assumptions to see them. Fortunately, once they're noticed, they can then be pointed out to everybody else, including straight folks like me, and I can benefit from their wisdom. And I deeply appreciate that this was pointed out to me.